Today, we're talking oil pressure. Got an AMC 360 with 146,844 miles. On cold start, let's see what pressure we got. Fast idle, we've got about 50 psi. Let's take it for a little drive and see how that oil pressure changes. Now that my engine is up to temp, my oil pressure has dropped. When I put it into gear, it goes down to, I guess, what's about 10-15 psi. The warmer it gets, the worse it gets. So we'll look at some solutions, some possible solutions, and see if any of them make any difference. We're going to try 3 ways of restoring the oil pressure in the Jeep J20's 360 V8 motor. The first thing we're going to replace is probably the most difficult of the 3 options, but it's not very expensive, and that's going to be to replace the oil pump innards, which includes 2 new gears, 1 attached to a shaft, the gasket for the cover, and then a pressure relief spring. Through Rock Auto, that's going to cost you about $25. If that doesn't work, we're going to go over and perhaps it's the oil pressure sending unit that is giving us inaccurate readings. It's not very difficult to replace that, and it's only $15. If that doesn't work, well, it's time to try thicker weight oil and a high quality oil filter like this AC-Delco filter. That's going to cost about $35. So we'll give each of them a try in turn, see what oil pressure each of them gives us, and then we'll come back with the results. Now the oil pump and oil filter are down at the bottom of the engine, right behind the alternator. You can barely see it through the top of the engine. So the way to access it has got to be from underneath. So let's go underneath and take a look at the oil pump and oil filter. There we go.
First attempt is going to be the oil pump. The oil pump is integral with the front cover on the AMC V8 motors. But the bottom of it is accessible through this plate that mounts the oil filter, that has the pressure relief valve in it, and that is mounted by 7 bolts. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of which you can see up in the front, and 2 of which are held in by the back. To take it off, first remove the oil filter. That's going to drain a lot of oil out. Next, take a 7/8 wrench and loosen. You don't have to remove, but you want to loosen while you have the oil filter or the oil pump housing on the car. You want to loosen this pressure relief valve because it's such a large bolt. Just get it loose. Once it's loose, you'll be able to remove it by hand with the oil pump cover off. Then it's a matter of loosening and removing the 7 bolts holding this oil pump cover on to the front housing, the front cover. These are 7/16 headed bolts. They're only torqued to 55 inch-pounds, so it won't take much to get them off. And you'll have to torque them back down when you reinstall it to that 55 inch-pounds. Don't forget about the 2 in the back. I'm going to loosen them all up first, and then remove them one by one, starting with the ones in the back. Make sure you have a drain pan underneath, and then just break the cover loose from its gasket. And there you can see the 2 gears for the oil pump. This one, that one is on a shaft inside the housing and will slide right off. The other one goes up to the distributor, engages a slot in the bottom of the distributor, or a tang. Might be a trickier one to remove. So a pair of needle nose, just grab and slightly twist, and the bottom one, God willing, will come right out. See that slot which engages the tang on the bottom of the distributor shaft? That's what drives the oil pump. Now what we are looking for is wear between the gears and this oil pump housing, which is aluminum. And you can see up in there, there is some wear. Mostly the wear is going to be on the housing itself. If it is really grooved, you're going to need a new housing. What we're going to do is clean up the cover. I'll show you a bit of work that needs to be done to that. We'll clean off this old gasket and then put everything back together. This is just a thin paper gasket applied with no sealant, so you shouldn't need a lot of scraping to get it off. You don't want to gouge the aluminum housing to which this gasket is sticking. So peel off as much as you can, maybe using a plastic scraper before resorting to any kind of razor blade. Alright, now that all remnants of the gasket are gone, I'm going to let that air dry. And while that's drying, I'm going to go clean off the cover and also sand it smooth, because it's got some grooves in it that I'll show you in a second. Now it's time to clean up the old housing. You can see some score marks in the bottom of the housing from the old gears riding against it. You can't avoid that. I am going to try to smooth this out on some high grit sandpaper, try to minimize those grooves. Before we clean it out though, we have to take out that pressure relief spring. There we go. As well as something that looks like this, that this spring sits in. And that's the little pintle that opens and closes with the oil pressure to adjust and regulate the oil pressure. We'll try to get that one free. Let's try cleaning it off first. I will share with you the reason why I am skeptical that this oil pump rebuild kit is going to appreciably raise the oil pressure on my engine. There is not a dramatic difference in the amount of wear on the old gear compared to the new gear. It's a little bit of grooving around the edges of these gears, but that's about it. There's no major wear. The ends don't show any signs of profound wear. Little scratches, perhaps, but that's about it. The springs are about the same height, about the same tension, and this little pintle that adjusts the oil pressure at the end, that is in good shape on the old one. So replacing it with a new one won't necessarily raise oil pressure. One thing that might improve, although slightly, is if I surface this end plate. You can see some circular grooves where these gears were riding. If I get some fine sandpaper and smooth this out on a piece of glass, I can minimize the depth of those grooves and perhaps, just perhaps, raise the oil pressure a slight bit. What I'm going to do to smooth out this surface is to lay some fine grit sandpaper on a piece of glass, get some WD-40 on there as a lubricant, and then just gently go back and forth making sure not to cock this piece as I move it back and forth, pushing it low and even. The glass provides a flat surface because you don't want there to be waves built up in this surface. It should be perfectly flat. You can see a kind of brownish, grayish haze in the liquid. That's a sign that it's pulling off some of the aluminum. It's a good idea to rinse it off so you have a fresh surface. You already see those grooves are starting to disappear. It also provides a nice clean mating surface if there happen to be any debris around the perimeter from the gasket. Note I am not even pressing down on it as I move it around. I'm just letting the weight of the adapter itself push down. You should feel it glide smoothly. If you feel any pieces of grit, stop immediately, otherwise you're going to wear a groove into the surface. Yep, feel a piece of grit. Time to rinse it out. I can still feel those grooves with my fingernails, so I can still go a little further. The grooves from one of those gears are almost gone. The other one still has a discernible groove. Alright, those grooves are barely noticeable, barely perceptible. So now I'm going to give some 400 grit a shot. And that should be the final finish. And I'll wash off the cover with soap and water, be ready to reinstall it. Getting to the point where those grooves are only visible in certain light. We're almost there. Almost all gone. And you can see I don't have any directional pattern to any scratches on that surface. It's only in certain lights that you can see those grooves. So we're almost there. When you start with a fresh sheet of sandpaper, make your circles all the way to the edge so you're getting use of all the grit that sandpaper has. If you just do small circles in the middle, you'll wear out all the grit in the middle first. Alright, the grooves from one gear are completely gone, and the grooves from the other gear are virtually imperceptible. Now, if you could see how smooth that surface has come out. At various angles, you have to turn it in order to see that. It's just a tiny bit of groove right there. Just one more pass. There we go. That is a mating surface I can be proud of. And just the certain angles, you can almost see a trace of the grooves that were ground in there by the gears. But that's just a trace. You can't feel it with your fingernails. So that's going to be a sufficient sealing surface. Right now things are ready to go back together. First, I'm going to put the idler gear, not the driven gear, but the idler gear in the pump. I've just put some assembly lube in the middle hole. I'm going to push it on and spin it around, mainly so I can confirm it's not binding on anything, and so that I can distribute that pre-lube on the evenly on the shaft. Okay, but I'm not going to stick that on there right now because it'll just slide right out. Next, I'm going to put the driven gear in, and I've coated its shaft with assembly lube. I suppose you could just use regular oil, but I have a lot of assembly lube left over from previous projects, so I just coat that shaft with the assembly lube, push it up into the housing, make sure it will engage that tang on the end of the distributor shaft, and I'll try to wiggle it out again because I got to put something on these gears, because without something to create suction, this pump will not pump oil when I start it up. The factory recommends Vaseline. So let's put our driven gear back up in the housing, lining it up with the distributor shaft. You see I've packed all those gears with petroleum jelly. Now I can slide the driven gear, the idler gear there, up in. Pack those lobes full with the remaining petroleum jelly. When those begin to spin, it's going to create suction. It's going to pull oil up from the pan. And petroleum jelly dissolves in motor oil. As a side benefit, that petroleum jelly does a great job of keeping those gears up in place. You don't have to worry about them sliding out when you install the cover. You still do want to clean the mating surfaces, however, because you're going to have to seal a gasket against this. So as clean and dry as those mating surfaces can be, maybe with some brake clean on a clean shop towel, that's not a bad idea. People familiar with the factory installation procedure, they'll note that I am omitting a step that is included in the factory manual. The factory manual has a step for measuring the end clearance of those gears. The reason I am omitting that is because that I can't do anything about it at this point. At this point, those gears are going to have whatever end clearance they have. Now, I lifted this cover into place with 2 bolts protruding through the gasket. I do that to keep the gasket in place, because it's easy to slip out of place. So to make sure that gasket does not slip out of place, I pushed it up into place with 2 bolts protruding through the gasket. Now it's in position. All I have to do is add the other 5 bolts in addition to the 2 I've just installed. They should thread easily by hand. Those threads should not be dirty at all, should offer no resistance. I'm going to torque these down to 55 inch-pounds, not foot-pounds. If you torque it down to 55 foot-pounds, you'll do grave damage to your timing cover housing. You just strip those holes right out. I got the 2 bolts in the back, the 2 that you cannot see from the front. And remember, there are 2. So when you try to remove this, don't come away with 6 bolts thinking you can just pull it off. There are no washers on these. These are just straight, clean bolts bolting up against the aluminum. 55 inch-pounds is not very much, so I've just snugged them down so there's no clearance, and I'll go get my torque wrench and torque them down to spec. You can't believe how light a touch it takes to get to 55 inch-pounds. You think you're not tightening it enough. just by snugging those down a little bit by hand, I reached about 55 inch-pounds. Just go around, make sure they're all tightened to that level. Make sure I didn't forget any. That's that. And last but not least, I put this pressure relief spring cap on, but I didn't tighten it. Now I'm going to tighten it about the way I would tighten an oil pan bolt, snug, so that this sealing washer is crushed tight. Now put the oil filter on and we're ready to try starting it up. Like I said, my expectations for this to solve the low oil pressure problem are minimal, but I at least take it out of the equation for about $25. It's a reasonable bet.
All right, now the engine's warmed up, and after the oil pump change, no difference. If I put it into gear, it drops down to about where it was before I changed the oil pump. If I put it in park or neutral and give it a rev, it's about what it was before. So, can I solve my oil pressure problems by changing the oil pump? That didn't work. Any oil pressure improvements were minor at best. Maybe the problem is that the gauge is reading wrong. That could be it. Maybe I do have good oil pressure, but maybe the sending unit has gone bad. So, let's try to change out the oil pressure switch and see if that corrects the problem. It's only $15. It can't hurt to replace it.